Hello, everyone. Oh,
Hi.
Hi. I'm just making sure that the live streaming is up and running. And yes, it is. Okay, good. So I think it's just YouTube, but let me double check because I know someone is unable to make it today. I think we're fine. Okay.
Hey, I finally was able to join. Eva won't be able to join us. They're having the power outage.
Oof. I just saw Naomi come into the weight room,
Naomi.
so I'm bringing her or them.
Yay.
Okay. Let's see. And like I said, live streaming is working, so we are good to go on that round. I know Dean likes to live blog, so the first question is, are you okay with live blogging? Just making sure that the live streaming is up and running. Okay. Naomi, are you there? I'll just get it. Hopefully it says 5 participants, but Naomi, can you go camera live? Hopefully they're able to do so. If not, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to make that happen again. It's been a while. They keep changing things. Here we go. Show non-video participants. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, Naomi's still connecting to audio. Okay. So remind me, Kimberly and Cait, I think I've had you in a previous episode.
Maybe not me.
Not you. Okay.
No, not me.
All right. So then I guess you look like someone that I know. Naomi, I think I've had you on a previous episode.
Hi, sorry. I went to get some water and locked myself out of the office space. So. To find someone with a card to let me in.
The dexterous deeds of water these days. I love that the automatic water fillers now are like, okay, you get a limited amount, we're going to ration you, and then they shut off all by themselves.
Oh, wow.
All right, thank you, everyone. So before we officially start, we are live streaming. I checked that it is working. Dean is planning to do some live blogging, unless you indicate otherwise that you do not wish to have that done. The way we always start is I introduce the discussion, and then I would throw it to each of you to introduce yourselves, and then I kind of just get the conversation going with a question. And I might want to say something on this topic to begin with, just for how I think it connects with popular culture, but that might be then how we start the conversation rolling. So any questions or concerns, or are we all 5 by 5? Sweet, 5 by 5. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming today to this popular culture dialogue. I'm going to try to sit a little bit back. I'm trying to figure out why my face is like doing a two-face shadow thing at this point, but office life. Thank you for coming to this popular culture dialogue from the Popular Culture Studies Journal. Today's topic is all about inherited fandoms. And we're going to start like we usually do by throwing it to each of the panelists to introduce themselves and what brings them here. And then we'll kind of get into the conversation about inherited fandoms, what they are, why they matter, and, you know, maybe what they can tell us or about everyday life these days. So we're going to throw over to the person who is most on my, you know, left, I guess. We're going to go over to Kimberly first to introduce herself.
Hi, I am Kimberly Hirsch. I am a postdoctoral scholar at the Connected Learning Lab at the University of California, Irvine. Currently working from Alsmeer, the Netherlands, as I accompany my husband for his Fulbright. So that's very exciting. I am currently working on how libraries can support interest-driven learning, and that's sort of my big picture idea. but I have my own ideas about how pop culture and fandom tie into that. And I am here because Dean sent me a list of possible topics, and I was like, this is the one that I have something to say about. So because of my own experience as a second generation fan, and we can get into that more once we're actually talking.
But I like that idea too of thinking about the generations, and it makes me wonder how much, like how long might the generational train be for some of these? So that'll be an interesting thing to talk about for sure. Thank you, Kimberly, for being here, and not gonna at all be jealous about being over in the Netherlands right now. Nah, not at all. All right, let's move over to my right and go to Cait.
Hi, I'm an associate professor and curator of rare books and manuscripts at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My work largely, I think of it as literary history. And so I like looking at the history of fandom and then pushing it backwards. I think you can see transformative works going well into the 16th and 17th centuries, but the bulk of the stuff that I work on is 20th and 21st century.
Ooh, and I like the idea of looking back in time too, because I think about some of the fandoms that started all the way back in the 19th century, how much they've had to be passed down through the years. That'll be a good approach. Thank you, Cait, for being here. Now we go down to the person who's below me, at least in terms of the Zoom screen, Naomi.
Hi, I'm Naomi Jacobs. I'm in the UK at Lancaster University in the School of Design. And I'm a lecturer in the School of Design, and I'm really interested in technology as my kind of key area, and how we think about using design approaches to think about making technology that is positive rather than negative, that, you know, I'm interested in kind of ethical issues around privacy bias, and also just how people communicate and interact using technology. And that's kind of where it interlinks with some of my interest in fan studies. I've done things around how fans use online communities, use technology and also physical spaces as well. And that physical digital crossover is an area of interest. So I did some stuff on physical books from online fan fiction, for example. And the reason I also was given a list of topics by Dean and thought this one was possibly the one I had something interesting to say on. Particularly, it made me think of some stuff that came out of some research I did a couple of years back, looking at fans watching Doctor Who being streamed on Twitch. And there was some interesting stuff around people, again, sharing it generationally, and different people who'd maybe been watching the show since the 1960s, bringing their experience to people coming in and watching it for the first time. So that was kind of an interesting thing from my personal research. And as a fan, I've again known lots of second generation fans, which I think is fascinating. So yeah.
Well, certainly, and I especially like that idea of thinking about the archiving of, you know, these fandoms too, and how that then would relate to the perpetuation of the fandom, and then of course the perpetuation of the popular culture. And that's kind of where I just want to start too. And I think I've said my perspective on how I see all these connecting in the past, but this seems to be a topic where that might be good to reiterate. And of course, we are the Popular Culture Studies Journal. But I think when we talk about popular culture, we have to remember all the different constitutive parts of it. And oftentimes popular culture studies seems to have focused more on the texts and the artifacts that have been developed and through which the popular culture is expressed and around which it forms. But that around which it forms and the forming of the reception, I mean, that's where a lot of fan studies, I do think, comes in, because the whole nomenclature of popular being part of it is popular is something that we like, something that we're connected with. And that's fundamental to how we think about fandom these days. And then, of course, you have everything that is about the production of the texts and the artifacts, and how that behind the scenes, the producer levels, how that interacts then with the fans in particular, and the people who are making something popular through their engagement with the text or the artifact. So for the reason why I wanted to bring in the inherited fandom idea is to think about that idea of, we think of fandom in one way as kind of this abstract thing. It has no physical form. It is something that exists through the expression, through the activities that people do. Otherwise, it's a subjective state. And when we think about inherited things, though, we're then thinking about physical objects traditionally that you're able to pass down from generation to generation. You know, you inherit something from your parents, your grandparents, and all these things. And these physical, tangible objects passed down through time with the meaning associated with it. So then that brings up the question, well, if a popular culture is able to perpetuate across time, across generations, what is it that's being passed down? Is it just those objects of popular culture, or is it something about the fandom associated with those objects? And if it's the fandom, what is being passed down then? So I think that is my way of opening the topic with the first question of, what do we mean by inherited fandom? And I'm curious to hear what you all think is a way to conceptualize that.
I will happily start with what I think is a fairly narrow conception that I'm excited to hear you all broaden out, because I really do think of this, the way I always talk about it is, you hear people call Star Trek the mother fandom, but literally for me, Star Trek is my mother's fandom. And so that is sort of where I begin to think about it, was as this idea of a thing that you do have passed down to you, whether, you know, it is through some physical artifact or through the shared media engagement. You know, so when I was growing up, we would sit down as a family, both my parents, my sister and I. We have a younger brother who was born much later, and we would sit down, all four of us, watch Star Trek The Next Generation together, because both of my parents had been Star Trek fans when it was first in syndication in the very late 60s and the early 70s when they were teenagers. And then when I was in elementary and middle school, we would watch it together. And it's funny because there's this question of like, what counts as being part of a fandom, right? If it's just like you and your sibling and your parents, are you in a fandom? Do you have to produce something to be a part of a fandom? Do you have to reach out to people outside your household to be part of a fandom? But for me, and in particular, because one of the ways I think about my work is the idea of affinity spaces, which are places where people gather around a shared interest and learning happens. But the shared interest is the really important piece. And that's something that back when Star Trek The Next Generation was first airing was very hard to find locally, because right, conventions were basically your only option. And my family moved a lot and didn't really have money to pay to go to conventions. So it was kind of like, but I had my affinity space in my house with me. So when I'm thinking about inherited fandoms, it is in that very like domestic way.
I don't think that's terribly narrow at all, but that might just be me.
I meant like literally inside one house narrow.
Okay, that makes sense. Naomi or Cait?
Can I pick up on some of that? Because I was thinking when I heard the topic to some extent about something very similar. My kind of longest fandom that I've been involved in is Terry Pratchett fandom. And I started going to the conventions and events and activities from being a teenager. And what's interesting is that it's always been quite a wide age ranging fandom. It was, very diverse in terms of age and gender. And so there were people who had young families, people who met and had young families. And, this is 25 or more years of this fandom. So the people that I met who maybe brought their young children 10, 20 years later, those young children, some of them are now just as much part of the fandom and involved, people who were on the convention running committee early on, now their children are on the convention running committee. So it very much is from people who literally inherited that fandom. And, you were saying in your case, that was very much inside the home, but this is the same thing, but actually extended out into that productive, creative, communal fan experience that fandom to some extent has helped raise, children in some cases. And I'm not saying it's true generally, but it's certainly, certainly are people that fit that categorization. I've seen that in other, I've been to other science fiction literary conventions of a similar kind of format, and again there's people who said, yes, I've been in this world from a very young age with my parents, and it's become part of who I am and my culture. And so that's one side of it. And I think very similarly, one that maybe isn't necessary, because obviously we're talking about pop culture, but you can see a lot of links to, I think the most obvious inherited fandom is sports fandom and the team that you support. And that is very much inherited. Why do you support this football team? Well, it's because my dad did. And it's not even a conception of supporting any other team. That would be a betrayal. So that's an interesting aspect of the inheritance, where it's not even because you necessarily build that affinity for yourself, but it's because that's just what you're immersed in.
I still would say sports culture is popular culture. At least coming from the United States context, I think it definitely applies. And I know there may be some differences when it comes to football in the UK and across Europe as well. Cait?
So I tend to think of inherited fandoms a bit differently, and I think about it in terms of literal archives, what are in institutional libraries. And of course, that for a long time there was a resistance in libraries towards collecting fan material because difficulties of preservation, also cultural capital. But, Kimberly, you were mentioning Star Trek as the mothership fandom. Lord of the Rings fandom predates it. The earliest fanfics and transformative works appear in the 1950s. And so if you think about, fan history and what's inherited, what we usually remember are the Peter Jackson films of the early 2000s. And I remember being a young fan and online and seeing that and seeing all of the electronic archives of fan works that predated the film, and how they were very anxious about dealing with film-based fanfics. And this idea of gatekeeping and what is the real canon and who is the real fan and who appreciates this and so on and so forth is really important. And in turn, actually, in many ways, informs what ends up in the institutional collections, because it's usually not libraries that can always purchase this material. It's usually getting from donors who have amassed large collections of fanish materials and then want to see it to have a forever home for all of the other fans to access.
Yeah, and that's an important thing too, because with Kimberly and Naomi, you were talking about inheritance in the more traditional means of passing down through a family, but you can think about inheritance too in terms of the larger social and cultural. Like, we inherit not just directly from our ancestors, but from the larger social and cultural context in which we are born into. And I know, coming from, because I study, I'm a communication scholar, and one of the classes I've taught is race and communication. And we teach that with our freshmen. So one of the things you have to talk about is racial identity negotiation and the ways in which you come to learn about heritage. And in some ways, it almost feels like these archives provide the means by which generations of the current generations can learn about past generations and learn about the heritage of their, those who came before, the forebears. And I know there's more work right now being done looking at least within fandoms, the inheritance from fandoms perspective, and looking back at those archives and seeing where maybe certain things that we think of are modern are actually things that we've inherited from fandom in the past.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Cait, you can go ahead. Okay, I was just gonna say, as you all were talking, I was thinking about inherited fandom, like the bigger umbrella fandom, and fan practices and which ones are inherited. And so, Cait, when you talked about Tolkien, I started thinking about Sherlock Holmes, which in many ways is like the first Spanish-ish fandom, right? Not just like drawing on earlier works, but a group of people who are all getting together. And so, Naomi, you may remember this better than I do, because I can never remember the actual article, but I feel like you may have seen it. There's this fabulous, very early essay defining the canon of Sherlock Holmes that was genuinely written in, I think, the very early 20th century. And I read it in the course of doing work on my dissertation, even though I wrote about cosplay, so it was not relevant. But I came across it and I read it, and I was startled by how almost every argument made in that essay could be made about what should count as canon for any fandom now, and how, with a slight twist to remove archaic language, you could post it almost whole cloth on Tumblr and it would completely fit in. It was awesome. I have to track it down because I keep mentioning it to people and then I have to look it up every time.
Yeah, I definitely want to read that.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that, but I would like
haven't?
like to see it now. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, now I just want to do an entire like special issue or something where we just take that article and we riff on it and go off of it. I think that would be fascinating. Cait?
What I was going to kind of go back to was you know, the notion of generation fans and so forth. And there was a little while back, I had an interesting online exchange with, you know, an elder of fandom from, you know, pre-internet days. And we had a tense exchange about what fan fiction was, because they were adamantly of the opinion that it was the fan fiction in the old sense of it is fiction about fans that you saw a lot of in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And of course, today we think about, you know, fan fiction as purely transformative, purely derivative. It is something communal and it's something involving fictional characters, and definitely not, you know, the real people fans. Although I guess I take that back. I'm thinking about all of like the reader fics. Never mind. But the ways that we define things and how that informs kind of like the lines of our practices is really interesting. And I don't know, there's gatekeepiness and there's a lot of things going on, but it's also generationally informed. When I was a young fan, this was the way, and the kids today don't know what they're talking about. And I sometimes like sort of feel this myself, because I've been in fandom over like 20 some years. And so I see the discourse on Tumblr and I go, really? But things are always in patterns, and that's just interesting.
One thing I've definitely been noticing lately is there seems to be a lot of discussion around intergenerational mixing of fans, and there seems to be this kind of movement saying, oh no, you know, young people shouldn't be talking to older people, or, you know, why are you an adult still a fan, you're over 30, gosh, shock horror. And for me I feel it's a really great shame if people are keeping these strict generational boundaries, because again, you know, like you say, I've been in fandom such a long time, and I learned so much from older fans that I met when I came into fandom as a teenager. I posted on Twitter last week, I think it was, and I mentioned before the Terry Pratchett convention. One of the first friends I made at my first convention was 50 years older than me, and she sadly passed away last week. But, you know, I learned so much from people who'd been part of fan culture or just had all this life experience that I could share experiences with because of this common interest. So I think there's something lost if it's discouraged from being in a community with people of different ages.
And that kind of gets back to that idea of how does the inheritance occur? I mean, within a family, the generational issues and clashes are potentially not going to be as severe, potentially. The more general public, yeah, that could definitely be a problem. And it makes me wonder if older generations, when they clash with younger generations, kind of put off the younger generations from wanting to go back and learn more about the history and to dive into those archives and to find the older articles that are basically, you know, either set the foundation for things we do but we don't look at anymore, or are, you know, doing what we think we just discovered, that kind of thing.
Also learning from the mistakes of previous fandom as well, not just the good things.
Yeah. I think it's Hannah Mueller has a book coming out from McFarland that is looking at the history of conflicts within fandoms. And I highly recommend looking at that one too, because it's kind of doing that idea of looking at how things have progressed and changed, but you can see that idea of certain things that have started in the past and, you know, through the way that they've been adopted and utilized going forward, you can see that inheritance moving forward, I think, of what fandom is now in the 21st century. And Kimberly has shared a link. So when I put up the description for this video on YouTube, I'll put the link in there as well.
When we also think about inheritance, you know, I've been talking about libraries because that's what I do. And what I have also noticed is that there's kind of an anxiety about accessing library materials about fandom. Like, one of the things that I wasn't aware of until I was doing my dissertation work was the fact that when it comes to people who are doing research in libraries, it's frequently something that they are taught by their mentors, their advisors. And if they end up with a team that does not do archival research, they're really insecure about it and they have a lot of questions. Most institutional libraries are open repositories and they encourage people to come take a look at things. And so, for instance, when in other references to the fan archives that are out there, it's always something that you have to go to it, which on one hand, that's correct. But I think that gives this feeling of distance and difficulty that's not present. So for example, because, you know, we're in the pre-pandemic age, and even before that, a lot of libraries were doing digital reproductions and so forth. If you find a location of a fan text that is in a library and it's another state or something like that, go ahead and talk to the librarian because they can probably get you some kind of copy. Maybe not the entire thing because of copyright purposes, but they will be able to get something for you that can help you out and then help you determine if it would essentially be worth your while to figure out how to actually travel across the country or something like that. There's always an accessibility option with libraries that just really does not seem to come through outside of certain circles and certain disciplines. And I'm like, guys, go to the libraries. We're really nice and we're really cool. And we want you to play with our things. Please, please.
We have cookies.
I wonder about awareness of those collections in fandom more broadly instead of just in institutional settings, because I was just thinking about, you know, public libraries and the extent to which they do or don't have their own zine collections, and how I think often when they do, it's from events that they've held where they actually were like, come make a zine and we will collect your zine. And so I think it would be interesting to know if there are fans out in the world who aren't connected with academic institutions that would like to see those materials, which I imagine there must be some, and then what it would take to get those in front of them in a way that didn't feel overwhelming or inaccessible. I think a lot of people, if presented with a library finding aid or catalog, especially in my experience, sometimes when universities digitize things, the systems they use are not readily user-friendly for a lot of people. And so I wonder what it would take to get that stuff in front of people, because I have to imagine there are plenty of people who would be interested in it.
It also makes me think of, there are a lot of these smaller museums that I'm seeing pop up, and not as like pop-up museums, but as like a dedicated space that are very fandom or popular culture related. Like, my partner and I want to go to one here in the Chicago area that's apparently about sock monkey puppets. And it's just a museum for them. And up in Milwaukee, there's one that's just for like bobbleheads and things like that, which is another example of people, fans who have these collections, wanting to ensure that those collections survive in some way. And that's another way in which we see kind of that archiving of the more maybe the physical objects related to the fandom and the popular culture, so that that can be passed down as well. This has the same issue about access, maybe because of geographic location.
There's kind of the flip side of that, of I think this is something I saw in the work I was doing around the fan binding. Some people expressed a kind of anxiety of what will happen to these after I die, like who will inherit them, and what, you know, it won't necessarily be someone Spanish who understands these objects. So is it going to end up in a secondhand bookshop and someone will take it off the shelf, and is that a bad thing or a good thing? So I think there's also that interesting question of who will inherit your Spanish objects, and will they be appreciated? Is interesting.
That is an interesting question, because again, if we think back to the metaphorical root of this and the idea of the inheritance being an object of value, that object of value has often been associated with monetary value, but we're not necessarily talking monetary value here, are we?
Yeah, this is something that that I think about as a parent myself. My son is the same age now that I was when Star Trek: The Next Generation started airing, and he is not yet invested beyond just watching compilation videos where the cat Spot is just like all of his appearances compiled into one video, and then we play Star Trek and my son is Spot and I'm Data, and I'm very happy, but like this is as far as his interest goes. But I have recently started doing some very small zine style fan bindings, and I'm starting with Star Trek: The Next Generation stuff, and I am, keenly aware, first of all, that because I'm a beginner, I'm not doing it with archival materials, so who knows what kind of shape it will end up in anyway, but also that he might not want it, especially because if I get into like Picard Q/ that stuff gets pretty racy, and my son might be like, I didn't need to know that my mom spent hours of her time typesetting this. I don't want to know that she laboriously hand sewed this thing that seems deeply not okay to me. And it may be that he'll be like, I love Picard Q, this is great, but who can say? And so there's not just like, will they value it, but there's also like, will it shift how they see who they've inherited it from? What's the interplay there, as well as just, is it going to end up in a shop or a trash can?
I love that you guys are talking about fan bindings, because again, we come back to the idea of the object, and again, I'm a librarian, and so people are very fond of telling me, well, books are dying now, so what's it going to be like when you don't have anything? I'm like, I'm not worried about that at all. But we've also had this discourse in fan studies for quite a long time about there was a great shift from print fanzines to print to digital zines, and now we're coming back around to making digital print again, and in some cases it's on the individual basis of the individual fics that are being bound by individual people. But what I'm also seeing is a lot of crowdsourcing on things like Kickstarter to make fan books and fan calendars and other printed materials. And the fact that we as fans like things, we like stuff, and in particular, because again, the digital age, we like stuff that other people cannot take away from us, that can't get yanked by whatever system there's out there. So I think that's a really interesting thing. We are very focused on the artifacts and preserving those artifacts.
And Naomi, I know you might be able to talk about this some. I know in your work, if I'm recalling correctly, you talk to people about their motivations for fan binding, and preservation of a thing that existed only in digital form was one of them. Is that right? Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, so people basically wanted to, have this, people talked about, if the internet goes down and it's, post-apocalyptic, I want to be able to read my book, but also in a more kind of, realistic way of saying, what if the archive goes or the author chooses to remove it, is also a thing that people worry about, because, they have such affection for these stories, they want to keep it physically. But also, that was only one, I think that's one that's been written about quite a lot, but also the actual tangibility of having the books, I think, was a big part of what people spoke about. So although that was a consideration, I think it's also just the joy of the object. So again, that, having it on your shelf, being able to display it, it's part of that experience. So yes, it's about it not being able to be taken away, but like you said, it's also that, you know, we like to have things and stuff, but then it's, yeah, and people literally said, you know, what happens to this when I die? And some people said that they've actually written into their wills, you know, what happens to their books and their collections. So.
But it's interesting though too, thinking about, you know, the value of something that we have, and then we pass it down and we wonder, you know, how the value is going to be seen by others.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me think that it's the bonds that people form over these objects that are then really important to be able to developing and maintaining the value of the object itself. Does that make sense in any way?
Because they have associations with experience as well as the object themselves. It's representative of the community.
The relationship, and yeah,
Mm.
the shared affinity for something, I imagine. Because I'm thinking about it also just in terms of getting inheritances from family members and whatnot, and how it's the objects that they cared enough about to keep that I want to keep, because that's how I respect their memory. And I don't have examples of that in a fandom context. So I was wondering if and except for maybe Booyah, that could be one. And if you don't know, Booyah is from where I came from, northeastern Wisconsin. It's a specific type of stew that is made that seems to be a variation of a Belgian Franco stew that was made, and a lot of the immigrants came from that area. And Booyah has a very particular meaning in my family, given the association with great-great-grandparents, a long time ago, and how they brought it over. So it's been passed down, and I would equate that to a fandom, because you got to be a fan of eating this kind of stew, as it has both beef and chicken, and maybe squirrel and chicken, depending on where you come from. So you have to be a fan of this stuff to want to keep it going. And by being a fan of it, I'm also able to keep my memory and my respect for my family members who have passed before me alive as well, to try to keep that value going. Is that similar, I think, like Kimberly and Naomi, to your experiences with the Star Trek and the Terry Pratchett fandoms?
I don't know yet. I'm happy to say, though I think about it a lot. But I certainly can imagine that it could be. What you said made me actually think about some ways that I have used archives to sort of build backwards, like build an inheritance or a connection to fans who came before me, who I don't have direct experience with, and just for whatever reason, probably because of how young they were, my parents had not connected with other fans of Star Trek, by going to conventions or anything. And then when you have young children yourself, there are some limitations on your convention activity. I happen to know, having taken my son to some cosplay conventions when he was 2 and 3. But because of that, I have this relationship to like the media text through my parents, but I want a connection to the larger fandom that goes back farther than, the Discord I'm on that started only in the past few months. And so one of the things I have done is go back to these older archives from Usenet news groups of Star Trek fan fiction, and sort of tried to establish through that, and through reading the entry on Star Trek Next Generation on the fan lore wiki, like, who are the people who were big, who was editing things and putting them together. And I actually, even though I have not had built up the skills to do this at all yet, I actually contacted Jean Klug, I don't know how to pronounce her name, who was like a very big deal author and artist in Star Trek: The Next Generation. One of her paintings was on the cover of the first edition of Textual Poachers. And I just said, you know, you've got this really famous fic that I know you released in print, and now it can only be bought digitally from you. Is it okay if I bind it? And it was really cool to be able to connect to someone who, you know, when I was a child had been really involved in this fandom. And so I think, you know, in addition to it connecting me to people I love and want to maintain their memory, it has sort of allowed me to create new connections with people whose memory I will want to keep going forward, even if we didn't really know each other.
Let's see if there's anything Naomi or Cait would like to add at this time.
Well, I think about, you know, like the social connections and how that kind of reinforces the kind of other connections that, you know, you see in fandom. And again, I mentioned earlier, you know, if you think about it in terms of further back history, you have coterie writing where people are in communities writing things for each other, with each other. You see that in the 16th, 17th century, like all the time. And you see commonplace books where people have texts that they really love and they're copying it out. And the reason we have those today is because people were lucky enough that the notebooks that they had survived, and we can see these different iterations of texts. And I think when we are talking about like the fan books and stuff today and what survives, and the way, you know, Kimberly, you're just talking now about mapping the connections between people and trying to find them, that's history in a microcosm of reaching out between generations, making connections and so forth to reproduce and make something new with the zine that you're working on.
I think just to go back to what CarrieLynn, you were saying about the family passing on of the stew, and this idea of you have to be a fan of it. I think interestingly, it seems to go one of two ways, that sometimes the second generation will maintain that and be interested in it and value it because of, you know, it has that family meaning. But sometimes people reject it as well and actually say, oh, I'm not into that weird fan stuff because that's what my parents do. It's embarrassing. But then maybe there can be this kind of rediscovery later on of almost, you know, even like a generation past and saying, oh, you know, finding out more about where that, you know, what happened, that previous thing. And I think that maybe links to these very familial traditions of like the stew. And also I keep thinking about the links to religion as well, and the way that can be inherited or not in a very complex and similar way of, you know, do you do this because it's what you've always done and what your parents do? Do you have a personal connection to it as well? Is it something you reject and then come back to? I think there's all these different iterations of inherited culture, which is really what we're talking about.
Which kind of brings me to a question then. I mean, it seems that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the two main ways in which a popular culture has longevity is either the content producers who have the copyright, the intellectual property for the content, perpetuate it through, you know, constant reboots, remakes, blah, 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 franchise, all of these things. Or it seems that the other way is to perpetuation through inheritance and this passing down, whether it is directly through family or whether it is some type of larger social cultural fandom learning through the networking approach. I guess what I'm curious about is which one of those pathways, and if there's another one that you can think of, please let us know. But which of these pathways do you think is most likely going to produce the strongest, longest living popular culture?
My impulse is to go with almost like the franchise one, because I'm thinking of like a big mega fandom, Shakespeare, and the way that you see versions of Shakespeare plays being printed from the time he was alive to now. And the way frequently these are printed 17th, 18th, 19th centuries is as records of specific performances with the text of those performances, which by themselves can be kind of fun. There's like a famous 18th 18th century one where in Hamlet they left out the to be or not to be speech, which seems so weird to us, since to them. And so like the different choices that are being made by cultural producers over time, who themselves have to have the choice of, are we going to make this thing again?
Right. But I think that's the inherited fandom approach, because it's not like Shakespeare's still alive, or there's no estate for Shakespeare that has the copyright over the works. I mean, it's all public domain, right? So the idea that you have all of these fans, these cultural producers of Shakespeare, producing essentially these fan subs, fan dubs, fan translations, that I think is interesting, and I think it demonstrates the inherited fandom pathway.
I think the sweet spot is when you've got both, right?
Exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
Right. I think I would say the two, and for lack of a better term, franchises that I think show this the best are Star Trek and Doctor Who. And I'll say I could have been a second generation fan of Doctor Who, but I'm not. My mom loves it, and I tried so hard, and it's just not for me. So I haven't like explicitly rejected it. I just was like, I tried, Mom. But I think in both of those cases, you have this combination of cultural producers who keep making things, who know that there is this social connection, who work to feed that social connection. Right. The new season of Picard coming out is bringing back almost the entire TNG cast. And that's a thing that I think they're like, we know that people who are now grandparents and people who are parents are both going to want to see this, and they might want to show it to their kids. And you could have like a 3-generation thing where you do it together. And one of the things they did is they went to New York Comic-Con, and they asked the fans, to talk about what Star Trek means to them. And I'm sure that they deliberately were like, ooh, I'm going to edit this piece about a generational angle in, right? And like, if you want to get super meta, Star Trek The Next Generation has The Next Generation in the name. The first TNG movie is called Generations. Like they, as a business entity, are really cultivating that idea, I think deliberately, that this is a thing that keeps going. And people who are much better versed in it than me might have some interesting things to say about how there was a big lull in new production of Star Trek for a while, until they started making Discovery. But I don't have enough insight to say more than just, I think that as that has sort of picked up steam, they've really seen and started to value this connection people have to each other and families. I don't know if it's more than they have in the past, but I've definitely seen evidence of them doing it now. And I feel like, though, because I have not immersed myself in it as much, you see the same thing with Doctor Who.
And I think what's interesting also about Doctor Who, and I suspect this is also true of Star Trek, though again I'm not as familiar, most of the people who are now the producers and creators of Doctor Who themselves are fans and grew up as fans. People like Russell T Davies and Mark Gatiss, Peter Capaldi, who had a letter published in Doctor Who magazine when he was a teenager. These are people who have been fans and are now part of that production. So it is that kind of continuation. And I think it's like you say, it's a mixture of both that continuation that new fans can keep coming in and refreshing it, people who, just happen to see it on television, versus people who, are still keeping that alive, but also sharing that with those new people. And that was what was interesting in the Twitch event that I mentioned earlier, that, it was showing all these episodes from the 60s and 70s that a lot of people who'd come in with the new series in the 21st century had never seen before, watching for the first time and saying, wow, this is more of what I like. And yes, it's old and clunky and a bit weird and black and white, but we can see the connection. And then the people who had been fans for 50 years saying, yeah, and did you notice this bit? And this links with that. And here's a joke about what happened in the production. So sharing that knowledge with this new generation. So I think that that interplay between having something new to bring new people in, because you do kind of need that, otherwise it can kind of get a bit insular, but also that transfer of knowledge across.
Yeah, it's the same with Star Trek, not just writers and producers, but performers as well, who, you know, freak out because they're sitting on the bridge of the Enterprise. Like, I think, yeah. So I think it's an interesting thing because there is somebody with money who wants to keep doing it, and then they hire people who have that emotional connection to it. And then that naturally, I think, leads to this deliberate sort of infusion of the social element as they keep going. And I'm going to say that and be optimistic and not assume it's all very mercenary, because that would make me sad.
But and I think it makes sense, though, because on the one hand, you definitely, of course, have this initiative for profit. I mean, we can't get past that. I think when we look at things like Shakespeare and even Arthur Conan Doyle to an extent, and maybe even to an extent Tolkien at this point, those have been elevated to more of the canonical position. And so it's not necessarily about profit with those being continued. It's about there's some type of cultural value associated with those and helping to understand a culture. But just having, you know, the desire for profit or the desire for cultural knowledge and value isn't enough of a motivator to get these things going. It does seem that you need that passion associated with fandom. You need the emotional motivation to really kick that engine back into action. And at the same time, that engine cannot serve either the motive of profit or cultural knowledge if it doesn't have access to that archive that knows all of the content from the past to be able to connect back to, and even in the more meta way, reference through intertextuality.
One of the things I really remember with the 2009 Star Trek film and you know, the trilogy of Kelvin timeline films are somewhat controversial within Star Trek fandom for a bunch of reasons. But what I thought was really interesting was at the time, and this was still on LiveJournal, people were compiling resources of Star Trek history so that people who wanted to write fic within like this new universe could do so within compliance of the original series should they so desire. And so there it was a thing to pick out, you know, very minor characters from original series and then insert them into the new context to demonstrate one's own knowledge of historical Trek. And so, you know, this combination of links of memory beta and alpha, the wikis for licensed productions, you know, links to, you know, where you could download episodes, movies and things, lockdown, but you know, torrent, RIP torrents, and so forth. And this feeling of this is a different universe, but also we should give homage to, you know, this extensive history and be true to that. And yeah, it was fascinating to watch and it was good times and I miss them.
I really love that there were people who were like, I'm going to put the resources together for you, person who just came in, so that some gatekeeping person won't have even like the leg to stand on to tell you you're doing it wrong. That's delightful. Although really you should be able to be like, it's an alternate universe, leave me alone. But
right.
Or write what you want, because, you know,
yeah, F canon.
Yeah. Well, does that also indicate then that maybe gatekeeping is antithetical to inheritance?
I feel like it can be. I could imagine a scenario where I don't think there's enough cultural capital involved with fandom for it to be this way, but where someone's like, oh, you are my child and you know all the Star Trek things, don't let those posers come in. And I'm mostly thinking of this because I just because I'm living near Amsterdam, started watching the TV series Ares, which is about a secret society in Amsterdam, and there are lots of legacy people, and then like this one person who's not a legacy is in there. So I'm just thinking through that and that kind of gatekeeping and like just don't think it would work in fandom to try to do both at the same time, to like gatekeep through inheritance.
I think of mudbloods now, or mudbloods.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'm in two weird worlds. I'm in fan studies, and then I'm also in rare books and book history and stuff. And my experience is that fan studies doesn't think of itself as gatekeepers, although you can make arguments otherwise in terms of a number of other things. But it's very different in contrast to the experience I've had at Shakespeare conferences and other things where people will literally be talking to you, but looking over your shoulder for the more famous people that they want to be talking to instead of you. And all of that, weird navigation stuff. Like it is fan scholars. We have this an identity of we are the underdog and we do things because we love them and effective labor, etc. So we have all these other things that we can get all worked up about, but there is definitely more impetus towards collaboration and so forth and competition, I think. Something I submit to the group.
Yeah, well, also because like I believe there's literally one person in the world whose job title is fan studies professor, and it's Matt Hills. So nobody's going to try and take that job from him. And it's not like we can all vie for the one fan studies job out there. We all sort of have to be cross-disciplinary. And so I think I don't have a sense of whether there is this notion that you could like, elbow your way around somebody else to like build a connection with a more senior fan scholar who can then bump your career up. And I'm sure there is some of that, but I think, there are limits to it, certainly.
I think it's been part of the legitimization process of the discipline, that it's been far more collaborative because, of course, you want to draw everyone together and work together to legitimize. I do wonder then moving forward, as it has become more legitimate, as we are seeing programs at least popping up for study and whatnot, and you do have the generationality in terms of fan study scholars passing things down, if we are going to see more of those fractures within the academic as well, and kind of pitting people against one another, like if you have a mentor who says this is how you study fans, and then another one another place is like, no, this is how you study fans, and then you start having conflict over how to study fans, that could disrupt the inheritance and make it harder for progress to be made in some ways.
I think some of that does already happen just when you think about like positionality and ethnographic distance.
Or the fact that I come from a more communication and even more quantitative approach, and the quantitative approach is not that common when it comes to fan studies. So there's that type of thing too. Which we're coming up to the end of time, so maybe this is the end of time, the end of the world. So maybe this is a good time for a wrap-up question. What would you want people to inherit, either from your fandom or your approach to fan studies? What are you hoping to be able to pass down? I think for me, it would be open-mindedness and interdisciplinary transdisciplinarity, so that we don't lose the ability to learn from each other and from the past.
I think for me, it would be actual history, the acknowledgement that there have always been fans doing things, and there will continue to be fans doing things for as long as people are around.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I think just because I do sort of come down in that closeness to your object of study can have value as long as you really make your commitments clear. It would be the idea that passion shouldn't disappear as the discipline becomes more legitimate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Sorry,
it fuels so much of the work, and it would be easy to say, oh, well, we want to be real, so we got to stop studying things we like. And I think something really valuable would be lost if that were the case.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, because in this idea that, to me, what fan studies has really accomplished is helping us to bring back the focus on the affect and to recognize the importance of the affect, so that we're not just focused on the rational and the cognitive all the time. That idea that, you know, fans have always existed, I think, is another way of doing so, remembering that, you know, emotions are important to humans. We're not these logical creatures, and stop telling us that we're supposed to be. Naomi, I'm going to give you a final word on this one.
I think for me, it would be maintaining the interdisciplinarity. So, you know, saying this is something which can be studied from all different types of angles in all different types of areas, and that is a good thing. We shouldn't try and flatten it into we're all doing the same thing, and, you know, say these are the methods you have to use, like you said, you know, quantitative, qualitative, communications, design, linguistics. It should all be able to be in fan studies, and I think we need to find a way to keep that going, because I think that's really valuable.
Well, wonderful. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here today. I think this was really great. And like I always say with these dialogues, the ones where I get ideas for projects that I do not have time for, those are the best types of conversations. So I think you all have given me at least 2 or 3, and I hope you found some value in the conversation as well.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for watching, either with us right now or on delay. If you want to join the conversation, you can always join us over on Twitter. And if you want to be in a future dialogue, we're always happy to have you. So have a great rest of your day, week, month, year. Let's go beyond. Be a fan of something and enjoy life. See ya, everyone.